Sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it. For Carl Menlo, that chance came in the form of 40 acres nobody wanted and a town full of people who thought he was foolish for taking it. At 55, divorced and starting over, Carl inherited his great-uncle's abandoned farmland. The locals called it a junkyard. They laughed at him at the diner, shook their heads at the hardware store. A single dad trying to be a farmer. He wouldn't make it through winter, but Carl wasn't doing it for them. He just needed a fresh start. Then one day, while clearing the overgrown fields, his shovel hit something buried deep in the soil. What he found would silence every doubt and change his life forever. Could this forgotten land hold the answer Carl had been searching for? Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something special. Carl Menlo had spent 25 years selling pharmaceuticals to doctors who barely remembered his name from one visit to the next. He'd perfected the smile, the handshake, the careful balance between persistence and charm that kept him in the top 15% of his region. It was a decent living, decent house in a decent suburb, decent marriage to Linda, who taught 3rd grade and made a decent pot roast every Sunday. Decent. That word had defined his entire life until it didn't anymore. The unraveling had been slow, the kind you don't notice until you're standing in an empty house, wondering when exactly everything went quiet. Claudia left for college 3 years ago, State University, Agricultural Studies, a choice that had surprised him because he couldn't remember her ever expressing interest in farming. But then again, there were a lot of things about his daughter he'd missed while building that decent career. Linda filed for divorce 18 months after Claudia left. The papers came on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate somehow. Tuesdays were always his. Least favorite day, not dramatic enough to be Monday, not hopeful enough to be Wednesday. Just a day that existed in the middle of things going nowhere. "You were never really present, Carl," Linda had said during their one attempt at counseling. "You were in the room, but you weren't there. Do you understand the difference?" He did now. 6 months after the divorce finalized, sitting alone in a house that echoed with absence, he understood perfectly. The letter from the attorney arrived on a Thursday in March. His great-uncle Raymond had died at 89, alone in a county hospital, leaving behind 40 acres of farmland and a farmhouse that hadn't seen proper maintenance since 1985. Carl had exactly 2 memories of Raymond, a stern man at a family reunion when Carl was 7, and another brief encounter at a funeral when Carl was 12. Raymond had smelled like tobacco and soil, had shaken Carl's hand with a grip that hurt, and had said exactly 4 words: "Stay out of trouble." That was the sum total of their relationship. The lawyer explained that Raymond had been the last of his generation, had outlived his siblings, and the family tree had narrowed to the point where Carl was the closest living relative. The land was in Millbrook, a town Carl had never heard of, 2 hours north of his suburb. The attorney's tone suggested this inheritance was more burden than blessing. "The property has been largely neglected," the lawyer said, shuffling papers. "There are back taxes owed, though minimal. The house is technically habitable, but needs work. The land itself is overgrown. Your uncle was quite reclusive in his later years. Carl drove up to see it on a Saturday. Millbrook turned out to be exactly the kind of place you passed through on the way to somewhere else. A single main street with more empty storefronts than occupied ones, a grain mill that had been shuttered for a decade, houses that needed paint, and a population sign that read 1,200 but felt optimistic. The whole town had the air of something slowly giving up. The property sat 3 miles outside town proper, accessible by a gravel road that turned to mud in the low spots. 40 acres of waist-high weeds, rusted equipment poking through the growth like bones through skin, and a farmhouse that leaned slightly to the east as if trying to lie down and rest. The barn had collapsed entirely, just a pile of weathered lumber that had surrendered to gravity and time. Carl stood in the middle of it all, hands in his pockets, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not excitement exactly, More like recognition. This place was as lost as he was. He stopped at the only diner in Millbrook on his way out of town, a place called Rosie's that smelled like coffee and bacon grease and had exactly 11 customers scattered across red vinyl booths. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and tired feet, brought him coffee without asking. "You're the one looking at the Menlo place," she said. It wasn't a question. Word travels fast. "Honey, this is Millbrook. Word travels before you even arrive." She topped off his cup. "Your uncle was a character. Kept to himself mostly. People thought he was strange." "Was he?" She considered this. He was a man who lost his wife young and never quite figured out how to be in the world without her. Some people get strange from that. Others just get quiet. Raymond was both. At the booth behind him, 2 men in feed store caps were talking just loud enough to be heard. "City fellow thinks he's gonna farm. That'll last about a week. Raymond's land ain't good for nothing anyway, just rocks and regret." The waitress shot them a look that could have curdled milk, but Carl waved her off. He understood skepticism. He felt it himself. He drove back to his suburb, sat in his living room with Linda's forwarding address on the counter and Claudia's increasingly rare text messages on his phone, and made a decision that was either the bravest or most foolish thing he'd ever done. Probably both. He gave notice at work, put the house on the market, packed his life into a moving truck and drove north to Millbrook with no plan beyond showing up and seeing what happened next. His first night in the farmhouse, Carl lay on an air mattress in a bedroom with wallpaper from 1972 and listened to the building settle around him. Every creak sounded like judgment. Every gust of wind through the gaps in the windows felt like the house asking what he thought he was doing there. He called Claudia, got her voicemail, and left a message trying to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. "Hey, sweetie. So I did something kind of crazy. I inherited some land from great-uncle Raymond. You probably don't remember him, and I decided to move up here. To Millbrook. It's this little town, and the place needs work, but I thought maybe I could fix it up. Grow something. I don't know. I just needed a change. Anyway, call me when you can. Love you." She called back 2 days later, and he could hear the worry in her voice. "Dad, are you okay? Like, really okay?" "I think so. I know it sounds impulsive. It sounds like a breakdown. Maybe it is, but maybe that's not the worst thing." He was standing on the front porch, looking out over the overgrown fields in the late afternoon light. "I spent 25 years being careful and practical, and you know what I have to show for it? An empty house and a job where nobody will remember me 6 months after I leave. So yeah, maybe I'm having a breakdown. Or maybe I'm finally waking up." Silence on the other end. Then quietly, "Just don't disappear, okay? Stay in touch." "I promise." He meant it. He'd already lost so much time with her, he wouldn't lose more. The next morning, Carl walked his property for the first time with intention rather than assessment. 40 acres was bigger than he'd realized. Rolling hills, a dry creek bed that probably ran in spring, soil that hadn't been turned in decades but still held possibility. In the southeast corner, he found remnants of what might have been a garden, once stone borders nearly buried, the ghost of something someone had cared about. He bought work gloves at Carpenter's Hardware, the only such store in Millbrook. The owner, Hugh Carpenter, was a man in his late 60s, with carpenter's hands and a skeptical squint. "You're Raymond's nephew." "That's right. What are you planning to do with the place?" "Honestly, I'm not sure yet. Clean it up. Maybe grow something." Hugh rang up the gloves. "Raymond used to buy a lot of tools. Strange tools. Grafting knives, soil samplers, things most farmers don't use. Always paid cash. Never said much. Did you know him well?" "Nobody knew Raymond well. But I respected him. He was working on something out there. Never said what." Hugh handed over the change. "Good luck. You'll need it." The only people who welcomed him without reservation were Pastor Warren and his wife Denise, who showed up on his third day with a casserole and genuine warmth. "We don't care where you came from or how long you stay," Denise said. "You're here now, and that's enough." Pastor Warren was a man who looked like he'd spent his life listening to other people's burdens and somehow remained unbent by the weight. "The town needs new blood, new hope. Maybe you're both." "I'm just a guy with an overgrown field," Carl said. "That's how most resurrections start." That night, Carl sat on the porch with Raymond's property deed spread across his lap, a yellowed document that smelled like old paper and forgotten things. The official stamps and signatures from 1965 seemed impossibly formal for 40 acres of weeds and neglect. But it was his now. All of it. The burden and the possibility. He thought about what the waitress at Rosie's had said, that Raymond had lost his wife young and never recovered. Carl understood that too. In his way. He hadn't lost Linda to death, but he'd lost her all the same. Lost her to his own absence, his own careful accumulation of decent days that never added up to a meaningful life. Maybe that's what this place was. A chance to stop being careful. A chance to get his hands dirty and his back sore and build something that might outlast him. He had no idea what. But for the first time in years, the not knowing felt like freedom rather than failure. The first week passed in a blur of physical labor that left Carl's muscles screaming and his mind blessedly quiet. He cleared brush from dawn until his hands blistered, then kept going until the blisters broke and calluses began to form. There was something deeply satisfying about the work, immediate, visible progress that his pharmaceutical sales career had never provided. Every armload of weeds removed, every rusted piece of equipment hauled to a scrap pile, was proof that he'd accomplished something real. The locals watched with varying difference and degrees of amusement and pity. At Rosie's diner, conversations would pause when he entered, then resume at a lower volume. He caught fragments. "City folk playing farmer, and won't last past first frost, and Raymond's land is cursed anyway, always has been." Hugh at the hardware store remained professionally cordial but distant, ringing up Carl's purchases of work gloves, pruning shears, and fence posts with minimal conversation. The message was clear. Millbrook had seen outsiders before, seen them arrive with enthusiasm and leave with defeat. Carl was just another temporary disruption in the town's slow decline. Only Pastor Warren and Denise treated him like he belonged. They stopped by every few days, with food or conversation or both, never staying long enough to feel intrusive, but always leaving Carl feeling less alone. "Don't mind the others," Denise said one afternoon, watching Carl work from the porch. "They're not mean people. They're just tired of hoping things will get better." "I'm not here to save the town," Carl said. "I'm barely managing to save myself." "Sometimes that's the same thing," Pastor Warren said. By the end of the first week, Carl had cleared enough brush to see the actual shape of the property. The land rolled gently toward the south, where the hills caught the afternoon sun and held it like a blessing. The soil there looked different, darker, richer. Something about it called to him. He spent his evenings on the laptop, researching. What grew well in this climate? What could a single person, with no farming experience, reasonably attempt? The answer that kept coming up was grapes. Small-scale viticulture. Vineyards could be managed by one person, and the region had the right combination of soil drainage and sun exposure. It felt right. Not practical, not safe, but right. Which was exactly why he decided to try it. He ordered soil testing kits, sent samples to the Agricultural Extension Office, and started sketching plans for a dark, modest vineyard, maybe an acre to start, just enough to learn on. The extension agent called back with encouraging news. The soil had good drainage, decent pH, and trace minerals that suggested something had been cultivated there before. "Interesting property you've got," the agent said. "Those mineral signatures usually indicate intentional soil amendment. Someone knew what they were doing." My uncle owned it for 50 years. Well, he was working that land somehow. Good foundation to build on. Carl began marking out where he'd plant wooden stakes connected by string, forming neat rows that existed more in imagination than reality. He'd need to dig post holes for trellis wire, install an irrigation system, and acquire the vines themselves. The cost made him wince, but he had the money from selling the house. This was exactly the kind of thing he'd saved it for, even if he hadn't known it at the time. On a Tuesday morning, always a Tuesday, he started digging the first post hole in the south field. The soil came up dark and dense, clinging to the shovel blade. 3 feet down, the blade struck something solid. A rock, he assumed. The ground was probably full of them. He angled the shovel, trying to work around it, but the object was too large. He'd have to dig it out completely. 40 minutes of careful excavation revealed not a rock, but a wooden crate, about 3 feet long and 18 inches wide. The wood was rotted, soft beneath his fingers, but the shape was unmistakable. Someone had buried this deliberately. Carl's heart hammered as he worked the crate free. It was heavier than it looked. He carried it to the farmhouse porch, set it down gently, and fetched a pry bar from his truck. The lid came off with minimal resistance, wood crumbling at the edges. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, were leather-bound journals. Beside them, glass vials containing dried plant material, pressed leaves mounted on cardboard, and detailed pencil. Sketches protected by wax paper. Carl opened the first journal with trembling hands. The handwriting was precise, methodical, dated entries, starting in June 1978. Day 1 of the Vitis Antiqua project. If Margaret could see me now, she'd say I was chasing ghosts. Maybe I am, but what else is there to chase? Carl sat heavily on the porch steps, journal open on his lap. Vitis Antiqua. He knew enough Latin from pharmaceutical terminology to translate ancient grape. The entries detailed Raymond's obsession with a grape varietal thought to be extinct, lost in the phylloxera epidemic that devastated American vineyards in the late 1800s. Entry after entry showed Raymond's meticulous research correspondence with botanists, acquisition of rootstock, experiments with grafting techniques. The sketches were beautifully detailed. Root systems, leaf structures, cross-sections of vine tissue. This wasn't the work of an eccentric recluse. This was serious scientific research conducted in isolation. Carl flipped to a later entry, dated March 1982. Success. The graft on specimen VE17 has taken. After 4 years of failure, I finally have a living Vitis Antiqua vine. Margaret would have loved this moment. I wish she could taste what this will become. Margaret, the wife who died young, according to the waitress at Rosie's. Carl's throat tightened reading Raymond's words, the loneliness, the determination, the way he spoke to his dead wife through his work. The botanical samples were labeled and dated: grape leaves, vine cuttings, soil samples from different sections of the property. Everything suggested Raymond had successfully resurrected an extinct varietal and was cultivating it somewhere on these 40 acres. But where? Carl had walked every inch of the property. He'd seen no vineyard, no evidence of cultivation beyond the ghostly garden plot in the southeast corner, unless Raymond had hidden it, protected it, kept it secret from a town that already thought he was strange. Carl examined the sketches more carefully. In the margins of several pages, Raymond had drawn what looked like topographical maps, crude but detailed enough to show elevation changes, the creek bed, and a notation in the northwest corner. Primary cultivation zone, protected. The northwest corner. Carl closed his eyes, visualizing the property. That area was the most overgrown, almost impassable. He'd avoided it because the brush was so thick and the terrain difficult. But if someone wanted to hide something, to keep it protected from casual discovery, that's exactly where you'd put it. Carl carefully rewrapped the journals and carried them inside. Then he grabbed his machete and headed for the northwest corner of his property, where his great-uncle's secret waited in the shadows. The undergrowth fought him every step, blackberry brambles caught his clothes, wild grapevines, ordinary ones, tangled around his ankles, and the canopy overhead blocked most of the sunlight. He worked for 2 hours, cutting a path, before he found it. A stone wall, deliberately constructed, about 4 feet high and running 30 feet along the base of a natural terrace. The stones were fitted carefully, the kind of work that took time and intention. Behind the wall, the terrace had been carved into the hillside, creating a protected microclimate that caught southern sun and blocked northern wind. And on that terrace, wild and overgrown but unmistakably there, were dozens of grapevines. Carl stood motionless, hardly breathing. The vines were massive, decades old, twisted and gnarled from years without pruning. But they were alive. Against all odds, Raymond's resurrection project had survived. He climbed over the wall carefully, moving among the vines like someone entering a cathedral. The leaves were the wrong shape for any commercial variety he recognized. The bark texture was different. Even untrained, he could see these were something unusual. Carl pulled out his phone, hands shaking, and started taking photographs. Every vine, every detail, every angle. Then he called the Agricultural Extension Office and asked for the viticulture specialist. "I think I found something," he said, "and I'm going to need an expert to tell me if I'm crazy." That evening, sitting on his porch with Raymond's journals spread around him, Carl called Claudia. She answered on the 3rd ring, and he could hear traffic in the background. "Hey, Dad. Everything okay? I found something today, something remarkable," he explained, about the buried crate, the journals, the hidden vineyard. His words tumbled out, excited and unpolished. "Your great-great-uncle was conducting serious botanical research. He may have resurrected an extinct grape varietal." Silence on the other end. "Then, Dad, that's incredible. Do you know what that could mean?" "Not really. That's why I'm calling. You're studying agricultural science. Help me understand what I'm looking at." They talked for an hour. Claudia asked questions about the vines, the journals, the documentation. Her enthusiasm matched his own, and Carl realized this was the longest conversation they'd had in over a year. "I want to see this," she said finally. "Can I come visit? Maybe in a few weeks when I have a break?" "I'd love that," Carl's voice caught. "I really would." After they hung up, Carl sat in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the countryside. For the first time since the divorce, since Claudia left for college, since his life became a series of decent days leading nowhere, he felt something like purpose stirring in his chest. Raymond had spent decades working alone on this project. Carl didn't have to be alone. He had Claudia, had this discovery, had 40 acres that suddenly meant something beyond weeds and neglect. Tomorrow he'd contact the university. Tomorrow he'd start learning everything he could about viticulture and extinct varietals. Tomorrow he'd begin the work of bringing Raymond's dream fully into the light. But tonight he just sat with the weight of discovery, feeling connected to a man he'd barely known, but was beginning to understand completely. Carl spent the next 2 weeks in a state of controlled obsession. Every morning began the same way. Coffee on the porch while reading another section of Raymond's journals, then out to the property with a borrowed metal detector from Hugh's hardware store. Hugh had raised an eyebrow when Carl explained what he was looking for, but handed over the equipment without comment. "You're starting to sound like Raymond," Hugh said. "He was always digging out there too." The metal detector sang out its electronic chirps across the south field, and Carl learned to distinguish between junk, metal, old nails, scraps of wire, a rusted bucket, and the deliberate placement of buried crates. Raymond had created an underground archive, protecting his life's work from weather and time and the skepticism of a town that thought him strange. By the end of the first week, Carl had unearthed 6 more crates. Each one contained journals, botanical samples, correspondence with universities, and detailed sketches. Raymond had been writing to botanists at Cornell, UC Davis, and a viticulture institute in France. Most never wrote back. A few sent polite dismissals. Extinct varietals couldn't be resurrected. His claims were impossible. He should focus on commercial grapes instead. But Raymond had persisted. Alone, unfunded, working with hand tools and determination, he'd accomplished what the experts said couldn't be done. The most significant discovery came on a Thursday afternoon. The largest crate yet, buried deeper than the others, contained what Carl came to think of as the Master Journal, a leather-bound book 3 inches thick, its pages filled with Raymond's most detailed work. This wasn't daily entries but a comprehensive record, spanning from 1975 to 1986, the year before Raymond died. Inside the front cover, Raymond had drawn a map of the property in careful detail. Every elevation change, every water source, every section of the land was marked and annotated. But what caught Carl's attention were the 37 small circles scattered across the map, each labeled with alphanumeric codes, VE1, VE2, continuing through VE37, cultivation zones. Raymond had planted test vines throughout the property, experimenting with different locations, different soil conditions, different rootstock combinations. The northwest terrace, the hidden vineyard Carl had found, was labeled Primary Success Zone, V12 through VE19. Carl traced the map with his finger, his mind racing. If the hidden terrace held the primary successes, what about the other zones? Were there more vines hidden elsewhere? Had any others survived? He needed help. This was beyond what one person could manage, and his knowledge of viticulture was still limited to internet research and Raymond's journals. He needed someone young and strong to help clear the overgrown sections of property. At Rosie's diner that evening, Denise mentioned that the O'Shea boy was looking for work. Finn O'Shea, 17, saving money for college, willing to do just about anything that paid. "Good kid," Denise said. "His grandfather knew your uncle a little. They weren't friends, but they'd nod to each other at the feed store." Carl called the number Denise provided, and Finn showed up the next morning in a truck older than he was, wearing work gloves and an eager expression that reminded Carl painfully of Claudia at that age. "Mrs. Warren said you needed help clearing brush?" "That's right, $10 an hour, and I'll provide lunch. Fair?" "More than fair, sir." They spent the morning working side by side, Finn attacking the undergrowth with the enthusiasm of youth, while Carl worked more methodically, mindful of his 55-year-old back. During lunch, sandwiches from Rosie's, Carl showed Finn the journals and explained about Raymond's research. Finn's eyes widened. "That's amazing. My grandpa used to say Raymond was always digging, always working on something secret. Grandpa thought he was looking for buried treasure. In a way, he was." Carl opened the master journal to the property map. "I'm trying to find all the cultivation zones your great-uncle marked. Some of these vines might still be alive after 40 years. 40 years without care? That's possible. Grapevines are survivors. With the right rootstock and location, they can live for decades, even a century. These Vitis antiqua vines, if they're as resilient as Raymond believed, they might have made it." Over the following week, Carl and Finn systematically explored the property, using Raymond's map as their guide. Most zones yielded nothing. Whatever Raymond had planted there had succumbed to neglect or harsh winters or poor soil conditions. But in 3 locations they found survivors, gnarled, wild vines that showed the same distinctive leaf structure as the ones on the hidden terrace. Carl photographed everything, measured everything, documented everything. He was building a case, though he wasn't yet sure for whom. The answer came via email from Professor Iris Pemberton at the State University. Carl had sent her photographs and excerpts from Raymond's journals the week before, half expecting no response. Instead, she wrote back within hours of his initial contact. "Mr. Menlo, if what you're showing me is authentic, and I have every reason to believe it is, you may have one of the most significant viticultural discoveries in modern American history. I need to examine these vines in person. Are you available next week?" Carl read the email 3 times, his hands trembling. Significant. Historic. The words Raymond had never heard about his own work would finally be spoken. He called Claudia that night with the news. A professor from the state university wants to come examine the vines. Claudia, this might actually to be real. Not just family history, but actual scientific importance. Dad, that's incredible. He could hear the smile in her voice. I've been reading everything I can find about extinct varietals. If Uncle Raymond really did resurrect Vitis antiqua, it changes our understanding of viticulture history. The phylloxera epidemic supposedly wiped it out completely. Supposedly. Right. Because one stubborn old man decided impossible just meant difficult. She paused. I'm proud of you, Dad, for taking this seriously, for honoring his work. I'm just uncovering what he did. He's the one who deserves credit. You're doing more than that. You're making sure he's not forgotten. That matters. After they hung up, Carl walked out to the hidden terrace. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the overgrown vines. He thought about Raymond working here alone, year after year, grafting and pruning and hoping. No recognition, no support, just a man keeping a promise to his dead wife that he'd create something beautiful from their shared dream. Carl understood that now. The divorce, the empty nest, the decades of decent days, all of it had been a kind of dying, a slow withering of the things that made life worth living. But here, in this forgotten corner of forgotten land, something that should have died had survived. Not because it was strong, but because someone had believed it was worth saving. He pulled out his phone and took a photo of the vines in moonlight. Then he sent it to Claudia with a simple message. Second chances. She responded immediately. For the vines or for you? Both, he typed back. Definitely both. The days before Professor Pemberton's visit passed in a blur of preparation. Carl cleared better access to the hidden terrace, marked each surviving vine with numbered tags, and created a basic inventory. Finn helped build a rough path through the worst of the undergrowth, making it possible to reach the terrace without a machete. Hugh stopped by one afternoon, ostensibly to drop off supplies, but really to see what all the fuss was about. Carl showed him the journals and the vines, watching the older man's face shift from skepticism to something like wonder. I'll be damned, Hugh said quietly, touching one of the ancient vines with surprising gentleness. Raymond actually did it. All those years we thought he was crazy and he was doing this. Did you know him well? Nobody knew Raymond well. But I remember when his wife died, 1975, I think, cancer. She was young, only 40 or so. Raymond just disappeared after that, quit his job, moved out here, barely spoke to anyone. Hugh shook his head. We thought grief broke him. Didn't realize it was fueling him. She wanted a vineyard, Carl said. It's in his journals. They'd planned to build it together. So he built it alone. Hugh was quiet for a moment. That's love, I suppose. The kind that doesn't quit just because the other person's gone. That night, Carl, read the earliest entries in the Master Journal, from right after Margaret's death. Raymond's handwriting was shaky, the entries brief and raw. The doctors said 6 months. She lasted 4. I keep thinking I should have seen it sooner, done something more. But cancer doesn't negotiate. It takes what it wants. She made me promise I wouldn't give up on the vineyard dream. So I won't, even if I have to do it alone. Especially if I have to do it alone. Carl closed the journal carefully, his vision blurred. He thought about his own losses, his marriage, his relationship with Claudia, the years he'd spent being present, but not there. Linda had been right about that. He'd been going through the motions of life without actually living it. But Raymond had shown a different way. When faced with unbearable loss, he'd chosen to build something, to resurrect something, to transform grief into growth. It had taken him 40 years, working alone, dying before he saw his work recognized. Carl wouldn't make the same mistake. He had time, had Claudia coming back into his life, had a community that was slowly warming to him. And he had these vines, Raymond's legacy, Margaret's dream, and now his responsibility. He would see this through. Not alone like Raymond, but with the help of everyone who was willing to believe that what was lost could be found again. Professor Iris Pemberton arrived on a Wednesday morning in a university van, packed with equipment and accompanied by 2 graduate students who looked barely older than Finn. She was in her early 60s, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical bun and the kind of weathered hands that came from years of fieldwork rather than just laboratory study. Carl met them at the farmhouse, nervous in a way he hadn't been since his first pharmaceutical sales presentation 26 years ago. This mattered in a way that Job never had. "Mr. Menlo." Her handshake was firm. "Thank you for contacting us. If your photographs are accurate, this is quite extraordinary. Please, call me Carl. And I hope they are. I mean, I know they are. The vines are real. I just hope they're what I think they are." She smiled, and it softened her serious expression. "Let's find out together." The examination took 6 hours. Professor Pemberton and her students measured everything: leaf structure, bark texture, vine diameter, growth patterns. They took soil samples from around each plant, documented the terrace's microclimate, and carefully extracted tissue samples from several vines for DNA analysis. Carl and Finn stayed close but quiet, watching the scientific process unfold. The graduate students spoke in technical language: xylem development, phenological markers, root system morphology that went mostly over Carl's head, but Professor Pemberton occasionally translated. "The leaf structure is definitely pre-modern," she explained, photographing a pressed specimen. "Commercial grapes have been bred for specific characteristics: disease resistance, sugar content, shipping durability. These leaves show traits we don't see in contemporary varietals. Meaning they're old, very old genetics." She moved to another vine, running her fingers along the gnarled trunk. "This vine is at least 40 years old, probably planted in the early 1982 based on growth rings. But the genetic material it's expressing is much, much older." By late afternoon, Professor Pemberton sat on the stone wall, reviewing her notes while her students packed equipment. Her expression was unreadable, and Carl felt his stomach tighten. Had he been wrong? Had Raymond been chasing an impossible dream? "Carl," she said finally, "I need to be clear about something. The DNA analysis will take 2 weeks to process, and that will give us definitive answers. But based on morphological evidence alone, I'm 90% certain these are Vitis antiqua vines, living specimens of a varietal we believed completely extinct." The words took a moment to register. Then Carl sat down heavily beside her, suddenly dizzy. 90%? The DNA will make it 100%. But yes, your great-uncle accomplished something remarkable. These vines shouldn't exist, and yet here they are. She looked out over the terrace, where 40 years of wild growth had nearly reclaimed Raymond's work. 3 of these vines are still viable for propagation. With proper care, expert care, we could revive the entire strain. What would that take? Years of work, careful grafting, propagation, cultivation. You'd need to clear this land properly, establish a real vineyard operation, learn viticulture from the ground up. She turned to face him. "This isn't a weekend hobby, Carl. This is a commitment that could consume the rest of your life." Carl thought about his cubicle, his pharmaceutical samples, his 25 years of selling products he didn't care about to doctors who forgot his name. He thought about his the suburban house, and the decent life that had felt like slow suffocation. "I've got nothing but time," he said, "and apparently I've got a legacy worth preserving." Professor Pemberton smiled. Then the university would like to support you. We can provide expertise, graduate student assistance, some equipment. In exchange, we document everything for research purposes. Your great-uncle's journals alone are worth publishing. The story of how he accomplished this needs to be told. He'd like that. Being recognized for the work, not just remembered as the strange recluse. From what you've shown me, Raymond Menlo was a brilliant amateur botanist who succeeded where professional researchers failed. That's not strange. That's extraordinary. After they left, Carl sat on the farmhouse porch with Raymond's master journal open on his lap. He found an entry from 1983 after Raymond's first successful propagation. The graft took. V12 is growing strong, new leaves pushing toward the sun. I told Margaret about it today, standing at her grave like always. Sometimes I wonder if I'm crazy, talking to a woman who's been dead 8 years. But crazy or not, I know she hears me. She always said I talk too much anyway. Now she doesn't have a choice but to listen. Carl laughed, then felt tears on his face. He understood Raymond's loneliness now, understood the way grief could become both burden and purpose. But he also understood that Raymond had carried that burden alone by choice, shutting out a town that might have helped if given the chance. Carl wouldn't make that mistake. The local newspaper ran a story 3 days later. Lost grape varietal, discovered on historic Millbrook Farm. The reporter, a woman named Cheryl who also covered high school sports and county commissioner meetings, wrote a straightforward account that somehow captured both the scientific significance and the human story. Suddenly, people who'd been skeptical were curious. At Rosie's diner, strangers introduced themselves and asked about the vines. Hugh's hardware store saw increased business as Carl bought supplies for vineyard development. Pastor Warren organized a community gathering at the church so Carl could present his findings to anyone interested. 47 people showed up, filling the small church basement. Carl had prepared a simple presentation, photographs of the vines, excerpts from Raymond's journals, Professor Pemberton's preliminary findings. He was nervous at first, stumbling over words, but then Finn called out an encouraging question, and Carl found his rhythm. He told Raymond's story, the wife who died young, the dream they'd shared, the 40 years of solitary work to resurrect something lost. He showed the careful sketches, read entries that revealed Raymond's hope and loneliness and determination. By the time he finished, several older townspeople were wiping their eyes. Grady Hutchins, a retired farmer in his 70s, stood up during the question. Period. I remember when Raymond's wife died. We all thought he'd lost his mind afterward, the way he threw himself into that land. Now I see he was just trying to keep her alive, the only way he knew how. He cleared his throat. I've got 50 years of farming experience going to waste in retirement. If you need help with this project, I'm offering. Denise stood next. I can coordinate volunteers, get people organized, schedule work days. Hugh raised his hand. I'll donate supplies at cost, whatever you need to get this vineyard established properly. One by one, people offered help. The mechanic who could repair old equipment, the carpenter who could build a proper greenhouse, the bookkeeper who could handle finances if this became an actual business. Even the skeptic seemed won over by the combination of scientific validation and Raymond's deeply human story. The one notable absence was Vernon Potts, the developer who owned most of Millbrook's commercial property. Carl had seen Tim in the back when the presentation started, but Vernon had slipped out halfway through without explanation. After the gathering, as Carl helped Denise stack chairs, Pastor Warren pulled him aside. You've given this town something we haven't had in years. What's that? A reason to believe the future might be better than the past. Don't underestimate what that means to people who've watched everything they built slowly die. Carl drove home in the dark, his truck bed loaded with donated tools and his phone full of new contacts. The isolation he'd felt those first weeks was gone, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to belonging. That night, Claudia called with news of her own. My advisor approved my request. I'm taking a semester leave to work on my dissertation, and I'm focusing it on Uncle Raymond's project. The resurrection of extinct varietals, the importance of amateur research, the whole thing. You're coming here? Carl couldn't keep the hope from his voice. If you'll have me, I can stay in the farmhouse, help with the vineyard work, document everything properly. She paused. I want to be part of this, Dad, not just academically. I want to help you finish what he started. Carl looked out the window at the dark fields, thinking about the vines growing wild on the terrace, waiting 40 years to be found. Thinking about second chances and resurrection and the way the right work at the right time could heal more than just soil. I'd love that, he said. I really would. After they hung up, Carl opened his laptop and started making plans. A real vineyard would need infrastructure, trellises, irrigation, proper spacing. He'd need to learn pruning techniques, pest management, harvest timing. The work would take years, maybe decades to do properly. But for the first time in his adult life, Carl had years he wanted to spend. Not enduring time until retirement, not counting down to some future moment when life would finally start, but engaged, in work that mattered right now, today, this moment. He fell asleep at the kitchen table, Raymond's journals spread around him, dreaming of spring planting and his daughter coming home. Claudia arrived on a Friday, in early October. Her sedan packed so full Carl could barely see through the rear window. She stepped out wearing work boots and a university sweatshirt, looking both older and younger than he remembered, capable and confident, yet with something uncertain in her eyes when she looked at him. "Hi, Dad." "Hi, sweetie." They hugged awkwardly, the physical distance of years still present despite the recent phone conversations. "Let me help with your bags." She'd brought more than clothes, boxes of research materials, a professional camera for documentation, 3 years of pent-up words they hadn't said to each other. They worked in silence, carrying everything to the guest room Carl had spent the past week preparing. New mattress, fresh paint, curtains that actually blocked the morning sun. Small gestures toward making her comfortable in a place he was still learning to call home. "It's nice," she said, looking around. "Better than my apartment near campus. Lower bar to clear." She smiled, and it felt like a small victory. They spent the afternoon touring the property. Carl showed her everything, the hidden terrace, the surviving vines, the locations marked on Raymond's map where they'd found remnants of his cultivation zones. Claudia pulled out a notebook, already working, asking questions that revealed her academic training. The soil variation between zones, did he document the differences in his journals? Extensively. He tested pH, drainage, mineral content, even tracked frost patterns year by year. That's incredible methodology for someone working alone in the 70s and 80s. She photographed a particularly gnarled vine, getting close-ups of the bark texture. Most professional research facilities weren't this thorough. They ended up on the terrace as the sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the October sky in shades of amber and rose. Claudia sat on the stone wall, exactly where Professor Pemberton had sat during her assessment, and Carl recognized the same contemplative expression. "You know what's strange?" she said. "When I chose agricultural studies, I told myself it was about sustainability and food systems. But I think maybe it was about trying to understand you." Carl sat beside her, caught off guard. "Me? You used to keep that garden behind our old house. Remember? You'd spend Sunday mornings out there, and sometimes I'd help you. You never talked much, but you were different in the garden. More there than you ever were at the dinner table or at my school events." She pulled at a thread on her jeans. "I wanted to understand what made that difference. Why dirt and plants made you present when your family couldn't." The words landed like stones in Carl's chest. "Claudia, I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I'm just telling you what I figured out in therapy last year." She glanced at him. "I was so angry at you for so long. The divorce felt like proof that you'd never really cared about any of us, that we were just obligations you endured. That's not true. I know that now. I think you cared as much as you knew how to. You just didn't know how to be present, even when you were physically there. She gestured at the vineyard around them. But this place, it's like you finally figured it out, how to actually be in your own life. Carl's throat was tight. I wasted so much time. With you, with your mother. I kept thinking there'd be more time later, after the next sales quarter, after the next promotion. And then one day, you were gone to college and Linda was filing papers and all that later time I'd been counting on had already passed. You're here now. Though. That matters. Does it? I can't get those years back. No, but we can start from here. Claudia turned to face him fully. That's why I wanted to come. Not just for the dissertation, though that's real too. I wanted to see if we could figure out how to actually know each other. Not as the dad who was always working and the daughter who resented it, but as people who are trying. Carl wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I'd like that. And I'm sorry. For all the times I wasn't there, all the moments I missed, all the ways I let you down. I know you are. Thank you for saying it. They sat in silence as the light faded, the temperature dropping with the sun. Finally, Carl stood and offered his hand to help her up. Come on, let me show you the journals properly. There's something in them I think you need to read. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table with Raymond's earliest entries spread between them. Carl showed her the passages about Margaret, about the vineyard dream they'd shared, about how Raymond had carried that dream forward alone after she died. He was trying to bring something back from extinction, Claudia said softly, echoing her words from their phone conversation weeks ago. Like you're doing with us. That's what I thought when I first read it. He couldn't bring Margaret back, but he could resurrect something they'd loved together. It was his way of keeping her alive. Claudia found a passage near the end of the Master Journal, dated 1986. Listen to this. I wonder if anyone will ever find this work, or if it will die with me. Part of me hopes someone does. Not for recognition, but because Margaret believed beautiful things should be shared, not hoarded. She would want this to grow beyond just my grief. She would want it to mean something to someone else, too. He wanted to be found, Carl said, buried everything so carefully, documented everything so thoroughly. He was leaving a message for whoever came next. And you're the one who found it. She closed the journal carefully. Do you think he'd be happy about that? That it was you? I hope so. I barely knew him, but I understand him now. What it's like to lose what matters and not know how to get it back. What it's like to pour everything into work because you don't know what else to do with the pain. You're doing more than understanding him, Dad. You're finishing what he started. Doing it better, actually, because you're not doing it alone. Over the following days, they fell into a rhythm. Mornings in the vineyard. Claudia documenting while Carl worked on clearing and preparing the soil. Afternoons processing what they'd learned, Claudia writing while Carl read more journals or consulted with Professor Pemberton via email. Evenings on the porch, talking about everything they'd never discussed before. Claudia told him about a relationship that had ended badly, about doubts she had about academia, about feeling lost in her own way. Carl listened, really listened in a way he'd never managed when she was younger. There's this professor in my department, she said one night. He keeps suggesting I change my dissertation focus to something more commercial, more marketable. Says extinct varietals are interesting, but impractical for real-world agriculture. What do you think? I think he's wrong. I think what Raymond did here matters precisely because it's impractical. Not everything has to have immediate market value to be worth doing. Sounds like you've figured out what your dissertation is really about. She smiled. Yeah, I guess I have. On Wednesday evening, they prepared dinner together, nothing fancy, just pasta and salad, and Claudia mentioned something that made Carl pause mid-stir. I was thinking about staying past Thanksgiving, maybe through Christmas, if that's okay with you. My advisor said I could do most of my coursework remotely, and there's so much here to document. Carl set down the wooden spoon, turned to face her. You want to stay? Really? Really? Is that weird? No. It's, his voice broke, it's the best thing you could have said. She hugged him then, and this time there was no awkwardness, no distance, just a father and daughter finding their way back to each other through dirt and vines and the patient work of resurrection. That night, Carl sat alone on the porch after Claudia had gone to bed. He thought about the version of himself who'd arrived in Millbrook 6 months ago, divorced, empty, running from a life that had stopped meaning anything. That Carl wouldn't have recognized this moment. His daughter choosing to stay, a community coming together around shared purpose, work that felt like calling rather than obligation. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to an old photo Claudia, at 7, kneeling beside him in that suburban garden, hands covered in dirt, grinning at the camera Linda must have taken. He'd forgotten that moment existed until Claudia mentioned it, forgotten that he'd once known how to be present, even if only for Sunday mornings in soil. Raymond had spent 40 years working towards something he'd never see completed. Carl wouldn't waste his time the same way. He had his daughter here, now, today. He had work that mattered and a legacy worth preserving. He saved the photo to his home screen, a reminder of where they'd started and how far they'd come. Tomorrow, they'd plant new grafts in the greenhouse, small starts that would take years to bear fruit. But that was fine. He'd learned patience from Raymond's journals, learned that the best things grow slowly and require tending. And for the first time in decades, Carl had something worth tending besides regret. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October. Carl was at the kitchen table with Claudia, reviewing propagation schedules when he heard the mail truck. He walked out to find the postal carrier waiting, clipboard in hand, requiring a signature for the thick manila envelope. Back inside, Carl opened it, while Claudia poured more coffee. The letterhead read, Potts and Associates, Legal Counsel, and the opening line made his stomach drop. Notice of boundary dispute and property claim. What is it? Claudia asked, seeing his expression. Carl read aloud, his voice growing tighter with each paragraph. Vernon Potts was claiming the property line had been incorrectly recorded. According to survey documents from 1978, the southern boundary where the hidden terrace and primary vines were located actually belonged to the adjacent parcel that Vernon now owned. He was claiming 15 acres, including the entire vineyard site. That's insane, Claudia said, taking the letter. The property deed clearly shows he has a survey. Official county survey from 1978. Carl's hands were shaking. If it's legitimate, I don't know what that means for the deed. They spent the morning on the phone. First to Phyllis Drummond, Millbrook's only attorney, who agreed to see them that afternoon. Then to Professor Pemberton, who needed to know the project might be in jeopardy. Finally, Carl called Hugh, because he needed to hear a friendly voice tell him this would somehow be okay. Vernon's been buying up properties in Millbrook for 20 years, Hugh said grimly. Always find some legal angle. Last year he got the Henderson farm for half what it was worth, claimed an easement issue. Nobody could afford to fight him in court. Phyllis Drummond's office occupied the second floor above the old pharmacy on Main Street. She was a woman in her early 50s who'd grown up in Millbrook, left for law school, and returned to practice because, as she put it, somebody has to stand between Vernon and everything he wants. She reviewed the documents with practiced efficiency, her expression growing darker. This is sophisticated. The survey appears legitimate county seal, proper signatures, dated correctly. Vernon's father was the county surveyor in the 70s, which gives it additional weight. She looked up at Carl. How much do you know about Vernon's history with this property? Nothing. I didn't even know who he was until the church presentation. Phyllis pulled out a file from her cabinet. Vernon approached Raymond about buying the land 3 times that I know of. The last attempt was 2003. Raymond refused every time. There were rumors Vernon's father had done survey work on the property, but Raymond never mentioned any boundary disputes to me. Could the survey be fraudulent? Claudia asked. Possibly. But proving fraud 45 years later, when both the surveyor and the property owner are dead, that's incredibly difficult. Phyllis tapped the documents. Vernon knows exactly what he's doing. He waited for Raymond to die, probably planned to buy the property from whoever inherited it. When Carl showed up and started making something of the land, getting media attention, university interest, Vernon saw his opportunity slipping away. So he's just taking it? Carl's voice was raw. The vineyard. Everything. Raymond built? He's attempting to. Whether he succeeds depends on what evidence we can find. Phyllis leaned forward. Carl, I need you to understand something. Fighting this will be expensive. Court costs, expert witnesses, appeals. If we lose, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars. And Vernon has deep pockets. He can outlast most people financially. Carl thought about his savings, already depleted from moving and starting the vineyard. How long would I have to decide? You have 30 days to respond to the claim. After that, it goes to court, and the expenses start mounting. She softened slightly. I'll do what I can to keep costs down, but I can't work for free. I have my own bills to pay. That evening, Carl sat on the porch in the dark, unable to face the journals or the plans they'd been making. Claudia found him there an hour later. Talk to me, she said, sitting beside him. I'm thinking about giving up. Selling to Vernon, taking whatever he offers, walking away. He couldn't look at her. I don't have the money to fight this, and even if I did, there's no guarantee we'd win. Dad, I came here with some romantic idea about fresh starts and honoring Raymond's work. But maybe I was just running away from one failed life into another one. He gestured at the dark fields. Vernon's probably right. This land is only good for selling. Everything else is just me trying to pretend I can make something meaningful out of nothing. Claudia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, There's an entry in the 1979 journal. Did you read it? I don't remember. Raymond wrote about a boundary dispute with the surveyor's boy. He said Vernon coveted the land even then, tried to pressure him into selling. She pulled out her phone, where she'd photographed journal pages. Here, he coveted this land even then, but it's mine, legally and morally. I have the proof. One day, it will matter. Carl sat up. He has proof? Where? That's what we need to find. Claudia stood. Come on, we're not giving up. Not yet. They searched through the night. Every journal, every crate, every drawer in the farmhouse. Nothing. No deed, no counter-survey, no documentation that would challenge Vernon's claim. By dawn, they were exhausted and no closer to an answer. Finn showed up at 7 for his regular work shift and found them hollow-eyed at the kitchen table. Mr. Menlo? You okay? Carl explained the situation, Vernon's claim, the missing evidence, the likelihood they'd lose everything. Finn listened, his young face serious, then said something that changed everything. My grandpa mentioned once that Raymond hid important things in the old barn foundation. Said Raymond didn't trust banks or safety deposit boxes, kept everything on the property where he could protect it. The barn. Carl had been so focused on the fields and the journals that he'd ignored the collapsed structure, dismissing it as just more ruins to eventually clear. Show me, Carl said. The barn had collapsed decades ago, leaving only the stone foundation partially buried in earth and debris. They spent 6 hours excavating, moving rotted lumber and rusted equipment, digging through layers of accumulated soil. Claudia documented everything while Carl and Finn worked, their hands raw despite gloves. Finally, beneath what had been the main support beam, Finn's shovel struck metal, a lockbox, sealed in a concrete housing. They worked carefully to free it, then carried it reverently back to the farmhouse. The lock was rusted, but the box itself was intact, airtight, moisture-sealed, exactly the kind of protection someone would use for their most important documents. Carl used bolt cutters from Hugh's store to break the lock. Inside, wrapped in plastic sheeting, were the things Raymond had hidden: the original property deed from 1965 showing clear boundaries, a certified survey from 1968 properly recorded, correspondence between Raymond and the county assessor's office from 1979 raising concerns about survey irregularities, and photographs. Dozens of them, dated by the newspapers visible in the frames, showing boundary markers, fence lines, and stone monuments that proved the property line exactly where the deed claimed it was. But the most damning evidence was a letter. Raymond had written it to Vernon's father in 1979, confronting him about the fraudulent survey. "I know what you did for your son. I know the survey you filed is false. I have photographic evidence that proves the real boundaries. I could destroy your reputation and possibly see you prosecuted. But I won't. Not because you deserve mercy, but because I won't let your ambition make me cruel. I'll keep this evidence safe. One day, the truth will matter. But I won't destroy your family over your son's greed. Take this as the only warning you'll receive." Carl read it twice, his hands trembling. Raymond had known, had proof, had chosen mercy over justice. He could have stopped this decades ago, Claudia said quietly. Could have exposed Vernon's father, protected the property legally. But he didn't want to destroy a family. Carl looked at the letter, at Raymond's careful handwriting. Even when someone tried to steal from him, he chose grace. Finn was looking at the photographs. "These prove Vernon's survey is fake, right? That his dad changed the boundary lines to help him?" "Yes," Carl said. "This proves everything." They sat in silence. The evidence spread across the table. Carl thought about Vernon, aggressive, acquisitive, willing to use his father's fraud to steal land that had never belonged to him. Vernon deserved to be exposed, to face consequences for attempted theft. But he also thought about Raymond's words, about choosing grace over cruelty, about not destroying families. "What are you going to do?" Claudia asked. Carl gathered the documents carefully. "I'm going to talk to Vernon, privately. Before lawyers and courts and public exposure. Dad, he tried to steal from you. I know, and maybe he deserves everything coming to him. But Raymond showed me a different way." Carl looked at his daughter. "Sometimes the right thing isn't the satisfying thing. Sometimes mercy matters more than justice. And if he doesn't back down, then we use everything. But I have to try Raymond's way first." That afternoon, Carl called Vernon's office and requested a private meeting. Vernon agreed, probably expecting Carl to negotiate a quick sale. They met at Vernon's real estate office, a renovated storefront on Main Street with his name in gold letters on the window. Vernon was a man in his early 60s, impeccably dressed, with the confidence that comes from always getting what you want. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Carl, I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. I'm prepared to offer fair market value for the property, minus the disputed acreage, of course. I'm not here to sell." Carl placed the lockbox contents on Vernon's desk. "I'm here to show you something." Vernon's face changed as he recognized the documents, the photographs, the letter, the proof of his father's fraud. His tan faded to something ashen. "Where did you find these?" "Where Raymond hid them. He knew about the false survey. He could have destroyed your father's career. Probably should have." Carl leaned forward. "He chose mercy instead. I'm offering you the same choice. What do you want? Withdraw the claim, publicly apologize for the survey error, and pay my legal fees." Vernon's jaw tightened. "And if I don't, then I expose everything. Your father's fraud, your attempted theft, the pattern of how you've built your real estate empire. This goes public, Vernon. All of it." Silence. Vernon stared at the documents, the evidence of his father's crime and his own greed. Finally he spoke, his voice tight. "You could ruin me, yes, but I'd rather not." Carl stood. "You have until Friday to decide. Either way, the truth comes out." The only question is whether you face it with some dignity or have it forced on you. He left Vernon sitting at his desk, surrounded by the evidence of schemes that had finally caught up to him. Vernon called on Thursday evening. Carl was in the greenhouse with Claudia, checking the propagated grafts that Professor Pemberton had helped them prepare. The phone rang, Vernon's number displayed, and Carl stepped outside to take the call. "I'll withdraw the claim," Vernon said without preamble. His voice was flat, defeated. "I'll pay your legal fees and issue a public apology. But I want something in return. You're not in a position to negotiate. Hear me out, please." Vernon paused, and when he spoke again, there was something raw in his voice. "My father did that survey to help me. I was 25, ambitious, saw that land and wanted it. He falsified records because I pushed him to. He died 10 years ago, never knowing I was still trying to take what he'd helped me steal." Carl waited, saying nothing. "I've built my entire business on finding legal angles, exploiting loopholes, taking from people who couldn't fight back. And watching your project these past months, seeing the town come together, seeing something built instead of taken, it made me realize what I've become." Vernon's voice cracked. "I'm asking you not to expose my father. He made mistakes because of me. Let me take the full blame." Carl thought about Raymond's letter, about choosing grace over cruelty. "What else? I own the old grain mill property. It's been vacant for 12 years. I want to donate it to the town. And I want to fund an agricultural education program at the high school. 10 years of funding. I'll set up the foundation tomorrow if you agree to these terms." "Why?" "Because I'm 62 years old and I've built nothing that matters. I've taken and never given back. I need to start." Vernon was quiet for a moment. "And because you showed me mercy when you didn't have to. That means something." Carl closed his eyes, thinking about second chances and resurrection and the patient work of redemption. Withdraw the claim tomorrow. Write the apology. Set up the foundation. And Vernon, actually do the work. Don't just throw money at it and disappear. I won't. Thank you, Carl. After they hung up, Carl stood in the cool October evening, watching the sun set over the fields. Claudia came out and stood beside him. "Was that Vernon? He's withdrawing the claim, donating the mill property, funding education programs." Carl shook his head. "I think we just witnessed someone realize they've been living the wrong life." "Good, he should." She bumped his shoulder gently. "You did the right thing. Raymond would be proud." The next day, Vernon made a public announcement at the town hall. Carl and Claudia attended, sitting in the back with Hugh and Pastor Warren. Vernon stood at the podium, looking older than his years, and read a prepared statement. He apologized for the survey error, took full responsibility, and announced the donation of the mill property and the establishment of the Vernon Potts Agricultural Education Foundation. He didn't mention his father's fraud or the evidence Carl had found that remained private, just as Carl had agreed. The townspeople reacted with surprise and cautious appreciation. Most knew Vernon's reputation. This sudden generosity felt suspect, but the mill property was valuable and the education funding was real. People were willing to accept the gift, even if they didn't fully understand the motivation. After the announcement, Vernon approached Carl privately. "The mill property. I was thinking it could be converted into a cooperative winery. Local farmers could grow the grapes you're developing, share in production and profits." He looked uncomfortable, unused to offering instead of taking. "If you're interested, I'd like to invest in that project." Silently. No control, no decision-making. Just funding. Carl studied Vernon's face, looking for manipulation or angle. He saw only a man trying awkwardly to build something better than his past. "Let me think about it. Talk to the others. If we do this, it needs to be transparent, accountable. The community decides, not wealthy investors." Fair enough. Over the following weeks, the idea of the Millbrook Wine Cooperative took shape. Carl presented the concept at a town council meeting, with Claudia providing detailed research on similar models in other regions. The abandoned mill could be renovated into a production facility, tasting room, and education center. Local farmers could grow the Vitis antiqua grapes Carl was propagating, creating a specialty product that might attract wine tourism and economic development. The vote wasn't unanimous. Some remained skeptical, worried about risk and change, but enough people saw possibility to move forward. The cooperative was approved, with Carl appointed as interim director, a role he'd never imagined holding. "I'm a failed pharmaceutical salesman," he said to Phyllis, who'd been elected to the cooperative's board. "I don't know anything about running a business. You know about building something from nothing. You know about honoring legacy and bringing people together. That's what we need more than business expertise. We can hire accountants. We can't hire heart." Professor Pemberton secured a university grant to study the Vitis antiqua revival and its potential agricultural applications. Graduate students began rotating through the farm, helping with propagation and documentation. The greenhouse that Carl and Finn had built from salvaged materials was replaced with a proper structure donated by a regional agricultural supplier who'd read about the project. The vineyard expanded from the hidden terrace to 2 full acres of cleared land, with plans for 5 more acres the following year. 12 local farmers committed to planting propagated vines on their own properties, creating a network of Vitis antiqua cultivation across Millbrook. Finn received a scholarship from Vernon's new foundation, full tuition to the State University, where he planned to study agricultural engineering. He still spent weekends helping at the farm, now teaching younger volunteers what Carl had taught him. Hugh's hardware store saw business increase for the first time in a decade. New people were moving to Millbrook, drawn by news coverage of the grape revival and the possibility of agricultural renewal. The diner hired additional staff. 2 vacant storefronts reopened a wine shop and a farm-to-table restaurant. The town that had been slowly dying was beginning to breathe again. But the moment that mattered most to Carl came on a November evening. He was working in the vineyard, pruning vines in the fading light, when Claudia came running from the farmhouse. "Dad!" Professor Pemberton just called. "The DNA results are back." Carl straightened, his heart suddenly racing, and 100% confirmation. Vitis antiqua. Raymond really did it. He resurrected an extinct varietal. She was laughing and crying at the same time. "This is going to be published in major journals. Universities are already asking for propagation materials. Dad, this is huge." Carl sat down on the stone wall, overwhelmed. For months, he'd been working on faith, believing Raymond's journals, trusting the physical evidence, hoping the science would confirm what his heart already knew. But having proof, having certainty, made it real in a way nothing else had. "He spent 40 years working on this," Carl said quietly. "Died before anyone recognized what he'd accomplished. And now the whole world will know, because of you. Because you found it and believed it mattered." That night, Carl walked to the hidden terrace where he'd first discovered the vines. The November air was cold, hinting at the winter to come. He stood among the billows, ancient plants, their leaves mostly fallen now, the vines entering dormancy until spring. "Raymond," he said to the darkness, feeling foolish but needing to say it anyway, "I hope you can see this somehow. I hope you know your work survived, that it mattered, that you mattered." The wind rustled through the bare branches, and Carl chose to hear it as answer. He thought about the man he'd been when he arrived in Millbrook, empty, running, disconnected from everything that should have mattered. And he thought about who he was becoming, someone with purpose, with community, with his daughter back in his life. Raymond had shown him that loss could be transformed into growth, that what seemed extinct could be resurrected with patience and care. Carl had applied those lessons not just to grapes, but to his own life, his relationships, his understanding of what it meant to be present in your own existence. The vineyard wouldn't produce its first real harvest for another 2 years. The Cooperative would take years to become financially stable. His relationship with Claudia was still rebuilding, still fragile in places. Nothing was complete, nothing was certain, but all of it was growing. All of it was alive, and that was enough. Carl returned to the farmhouse to find Claudia on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, working on her laptop. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make us dinner." "In a minute. I'm just finishing this section on genetic preservation and amateur research." He left her to her work, went to the kitchen, and started preparing the meal. Through the window, he could see her silhouetted against the porch light, dedicated to documenting the story of resurrection and second chances. Outside, the vineyard waited for spring. Inside, father and daughter were learning to be a family again. And somewhere in the space between past and future, Carl felt Raymond's quiet approval like a blessing on the work they'd begun. 6 months later, spring arrived with the kind of warmth that made promises about the future. The propagated vines were thriving, the cooperative had been officially established, and the mill renovation was underway. But the moment that defined everything came on a morning in late April when Professor Pemberton arrived with 3 wine experts and enough testing equipment to fill her van. "Today's the day," she said, greeting Carl and Claudia at the farmhouse. "The 3 original survivor vines have grape clusters. Not many, may be enough for 20 bottles if we're careful, but enough to know what Raymond created." Carl had been preparing for this moment since fall, when the vines first showed signs they might fruit. He'd studied viticulture, learned about harvest timing and fermentation, consulted with winemakers across the region. But standing on the terrace now, looking at the small clusters of purple-black grapes hanging from 40-year-old vines, he felt completely unprepared for the weight of the moment. "These grapes represent something that wasn't supposed to exist," Professor Pemberton said, examining a cluster with careful reverence. "An extinct varietal resurrected by an amateur botanist surviving 4 decades of neglect. If the wine is even remotely drinkable, it rewrites what we thought possible. They harvested ceremonially. Each cluster was removed by hand, inspected, placed in small containers. Claudia documented everything with photographs and detailed notes. The wine experts, a master sommelier, a viticulture researcher, and a winemaker from a prestigious Napa vineyard, worked with the kind of quiet intensity that made Carl's hands shake. The whole process took 3 hours. When they finished, they had 43 pounds of grapes, a tiny harvest by commercial standards, but precious beyond measure. Pastor Warren had organized a community celebration for that evening. Tables were set up in the church parking lot, covered with dishes brought by townspeople who'd watched this project grow from skeptical curiosity to genuine pride. Hugh brought his fiddle, Denise coordinated everything with military precision, and Finn helped set up a borrowed press for crushing the grapes. As the sun dropped toward evening, nearly 100 people gathered to witness the pressing. Carl stood before them, Claudia beside him, and tried to find words adequate to the moment. "A year ago, I came here broken," he began. "Divorced, alone, running from a life that had stopped meaning anything. I inherited 40 acres of weeds and a town that thought I was foolish. And you were right to think that. I was foolish. But sometimes foolishness is just faith that hasn't proven itself yet." Light laughter rippled through the crowd. Raymond spent 40 years working alone on something everyone said was impossible. He died before anyone recognized what he'd accomplished. But he did it anyway. Because some things are worth doing even if no one's watching, even if you never see the results. Carl's voice thickened. "Today, we're harvesting grapes from vines that shouldn't exist. Tomorrow, we'll taste wine from a varietal the world thought was extinct. And next year, dozens of farmers across Millbrook will be growing these same grapes, building something together that none of us could build alone." That's Raymond's legacy. Not just the vines, but the lesson they teach that patient work matters, that what's lost can be found, that second chances are real if you're willing to do the work. Pastor Warren stepped forward. "Before we press these grapes, I'd like to say a blessing. For Raymond, who started this. for Carl, who found it, and for all of us who get to be part of what comes next. The blessing was simple and heartfelt. Then Finn and 2 other young volunteers began pressing the grapes, working the old-fashioned lever press that Vernon had donated. The juice ran dark purple, almost black, into collection vessels. The aroma was immediate and complex: dark fruit, earth, something wild and ancient that none of the experts could quite place. "It's unlike anything I've smelled," the Napa winemaker said, inhaling deeply. "Familiar but different, like smelling into the past." They collected 4 gallons of juice. It would be sealed in vessels, allowed to ferment naturally, and aged for 6 months before tasting. Not long by wine standards, but long enough to know what they had. The celebration continued into the night, food and music, and the kind of easy conversation that happens when people are bound together by shared purpose. Vernon attended, staying on the edges, but Carl made a point of thanking him publicly for the foundation funding and the mill donation. Vernon nodded, still uncomfortable with praise, but something in his face had softened over the winter. As people began drifting home, Claudia found Carl sitting on the stone wall of the terrace, watching the stars emerge over the vineyard. "You okay? I keep thinking about Raymond, wishing he could be here for this." Carl gestured at the empty vines, recently harvested. "He did all the hard work. I just showed up at the end and got the credit." "You did more than show up. You honored his work when you could have ignored it. You built community around it when you could have kept it private. You gave it a future." She sat beside him. "Raymond made this possible, but you made it matter to other people." "That's not nothing, Dad. Your dissertation's almost done, isn't it? 2 more chapters. I'll defend it in August." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what comes after." "Back to your program." "Actually, I've been offered a position at the State University, assistant professor in sustainable agriculture. They want me to continue studying the cooperative model, use Millbrook as a case study." She glanced at him. "It would mean staying in the area. If that's okay with you." Carl felt his throat tighten. "More than okay. But Claudia, don't make decisions about your career based on, 'I'm not, this is what I want.' The research matters, the work here matters, and—" She paused, choosing words carefully. "I like having you in my life again. Actually in my life, not just phone calls twice a year. I don't want to lose that." "Neither do I." They sat together in the darkness, father and daughter, watching the vineyard that had brought them back together. In 6 months, they'd taste the wine. In a year, they'd harvest from the expanded plantings. In 5 years, the cooperative might be fully operational, Millbrook might be thriving, the work Raymond started might be sustaining dozens of families, or none of that might happen. The wine might be undrinkable, the cooperative might fail, the whole project might collapse under the weight of inexperience and impossible expectations. But sitting there with his daughter, looking at vines that had survived 40 years of neglect to finally bear fruit, Carl believed in possibility more than probability. He believed that patient work mattered, that small starts could become significant, that resurrection was real if you were willing to tend it. The night grew cold, and they went inside. But the vineyard remained, waiting for whatever came next, with the same quiet patience that had sustained it through decades of darkness. Tomorrow, the wine would begin fermenting. Tomorrow, the work would continue. Tomorrow, they'd take another small step toward making Raymond's dream fully real. But tonight, they'd done enough. Tonight, they'd harvested hope and pressed possibility and celebrated the stubborn refusal to accept that what was lost must stay lost forever. And that was enough. For now, that was everything. 6 months of waiting, 6 months of the wine aging in sealed vessels in the temperature-controlled room that Vernon's foundation had funded in the mill building. 6 months of wondering if Raymond's life work would result in something extraordinary or just another forgotten experiment. October arrived cool and clear. Professor Pemberton scheduled the official tasting for a Wednesday morning, bringing the same experts who'd witnessed the harvest. Regional media requested permission to attend. Wine publications sent representatives. What had started as a personal project had become something the entire specialty wine industry was watching. Carl woke that morning feeling sick with anticipation. He'd learned enough about winemaking to know that 6 months was minimal aging, that many factors could have ruined the wine: improper fermentation, contamination, chemical imbalances. They might open those bottles to vinegar. Claudia found him on the porch at dawn, staring at the vineyard. "You're nervous, terrified. What if it's terrible? What if Raymond spent 40 years developing a grape that makes bad wine? Then we learn from it and keep trying." That's what he would have done. She handed him coffee. "But I don't think it will be terrible." Everything Raymond did was methodical, scientific. He wouldn't have dedicated his life to something unless he believed it would work. The tasting was scheduled for 10 o'clock at the Mill building. Carl and Claudia arrived early to find the space already prepared, tables set with wine glasses, spittoons for professional tasting, notepads, and evaluation forms. The room smelled of new construction and old stone, the mill's bones preserved even as its purpose transformed. Professor Pemberton arrived with her experts. The master sommelier, a woman named Josephine Crane, had traveled from New York specifically for this tasting. The viticulture researcher had brought equipment for chemical analysis. The Napa winemaker, Jeffrey Lang, carried a notebook already filled with observations about the fermentation process. 27 bottles survived, Professor Pemberton reported. "We lost 4 to cork issues, but the rest appear stable. Shall we?" She opened the first bottle, using proper technique. The cork coming free with a soft sigh. The wine breathing, releasing its first aromas into the room. Everyone leaned forward, inhaling. Silence. Then Josephine spoke, her voice careful and professional. "This is remarkable. I'm detecting blackberry, forest floor, something I can't quite identify, mineral, but not like any modern wine. It's as if the terroir itself is different." "The terroir is different," Carl said. "That soil hasn't been commercially farmed. No pesticides, no chemical fertilizers, 40 years of natural restoration." Jeffrey poured samples, examining color and clarity. "The color is unusually deep, good viscosity. It's actually beautiful." They tasted, according to professional protocol, small sips, held in the mouth, contemplated, spit into the vessels. But Carl saw expressions changing, eyes widening, the kind of silent communication that happens among experts when they encounter something unexpected. Josephine set down her glass carefully. "This is I don't have adequate vocabulary. It's layered in ways I've never experienced, complex without being complicated. It tastes old, but not in the sense of aged wine, old as in ancient, as in something our ancestors might have drunk. The genetic expression," the viticulture researcher said, studying his notes. "We're tasting a varietal that predates modern breeding programs, before we optimized for commercial concerns, for shipping stability, for mass production. This is what grapes tasted like before we domesticated them into consistency." Jeffrey took another small sip, this time not spitting. "Carl, I need to be frank with you. This wine could be worth extraordinary amounts of money. Collectors would pay thousands per bottle for something this rare, this historically significant." Carl thought about Raymond's journals, about Margaret's dream of a vineyard that would bring people together rather than separate them by wealth. "It's not for sale. Not like that. Then what? The first vintage goes to the people who made this possible. The community that supported the project. The farmers who committed to growing these grapes. The students who helped propagate the vines." Carl looked around the room. Raymond didn't spend 40 years working alone so his wine could sit in collectors' cellars. He wanted to create something beautiful that could be shared. Josephine nodded slowly. "That's actually perfect. May I suggest something? Keep 3 bottles for documentation and research. Give the rest to your community as you planned. But when the cooperative's vineyard produces its first commercial harvest, when you have 100 cases instead of 20 bottles, price it fairly. Make it accessible. Won't that devalue it? It will make it matter more. Wine is meant to be drunk, to be experienced, to bring people together over meals and conversation. That's what your great-uncle believed, isn't it? It was. Carl knew it from reading the journals, from understanding Raymond's motivations. This wasn't about creating scarcity or exclusivity. It was about resurrecting something beautiful and letting it grow. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Chemical analysis confirmed the wine's stability and composition. More bottles were opened, more samples tasted, more notes taken. Every expert reached the same conclusion: this was significant, historically important, and remarkably good. That evening, Carl organized an impromptu gathering at the farmhouse. He invited the core group who'd supported the project from the beginning: Hugh, Pastor Warren and Denise, Grady, Phyllis, Finn, and his grandfather, a few other volunteers. He opened 4 bottles of the wine and poured glasses for everyone. Raymond worked on this for 40 years, Carl said. He died before tasting the result, but we get to. And I think he'd want us to drink it together, not save it in a cellar somewhere. So to Raymond, to Margaret, to second chances and patient work. To resurrection, Pastor Warren added. They drank, and in the silence that followed that first sip, Carl saw understanding dawn on their faces, the realization that this wasn't just wine, but history, legacy. The taste of one man's dedication transformed into something they could share. Hugh set his glass down with shaking hands. I need to say something. I thought Raymond was crazy. We all did. Felt sorry for him mostly. The strange old man who talked to himself and dug holes in his fields. If he'd asked for help, I don't know if I would have given it. Too proud, too skeptical. He looked at Carl. You made me see him differently, made all of us see him differently, and that matters almost as much as the wine. Denise raised her glass. To Carl, who honored a man he barely knew and brought a community together in the process. The evening stretched long, bottles emptying, stories shared. People talked about their own losses and resurrections, their own second chances. The wine became a catalyst for honesty, for connection, for the kind of conversation that matters. Claudia pulled Carl aside late in the evening. I heard from the journal that wants to publish my dissertation. They're also interested in running an article about Raymond's journals and methods. They want to make his research available to other botanists and viticulturists. He'd like that. Yeah, he would. She squeezed his hand. We did good, Dad. We took what he started and made it matter. Carl looked around at the gathering, at people who'd become friends, at Vernon sitting quietly in the corner, actually enjoying himself, at the empty wine bottles that represented 40 years of faith in possibility. No, he said softly. Raymond did good. We just made sure people knew about it. But he knew that wasn't quite true. Raymond had planted the seeds, but Carl had tended them, watered them, created the conditions for growth. Both were necessary. Both mattered. That's what he'd learned from all of this. That legacy isn't just what you leave behind, but what others choose to do with what you've given them. Raymond's legacy lived because Carl had been willing to see it, honor it, and share it. And maybe that's what second chances really were. Not erasing the past, but learning from it. Not starting over, but starting from where you are with what you have. The wine was proof of that. Extinct grapes growing again, a lost man finding purpose, a broken relationship slowly mending. All of it possible because someone had believed that loss wasn't the end of the story, just the middle. 18 months after that first harvest, the Millbrook Wine Cooperative officially opened its doors. The November morning was crisp and clear, the kind of day that made you believe in new beginnings. Carl stood in front of the renovated mill building, looking at the bronze plaque beside the entrance that Claudia had designed. in memory of Raymond and Margaret Menlo, who taught us that what's lost can be found again. The building itself was beautiful. Original stone walls preserved, new timber framing that honored the mill's history while creating modern production space. Through the large windows, Carl could see the fermentation tanks, the barrel room, the tasting bar made from reclaimed wood. Vernon had insisted on funding the renovation entirely, refusing to accept recognition beyond a small mention in the cooperative's literature. "It's the least I can do," he'd said. "I've spent 30 years taking from this town. Let me give something back." And he had. Not just money, but time. Vernon had attended planning meetings, offered business expertise, connected the cooperative with distributors and suppliers. He'd transformed from adversary to ally, though he still carried himself with the awkwardness of someone learning generosity late in life. The parking lot was already filling townspeople, regional press, wine industry representatives, university administrators. Professor Pemberton arrived with a van full of graduate students who'd worked on the project. Finn drove in from college, bringing 3 friends who wanted to see the operation that had funded his scholarship. Inside, Claudia was making final adjustments to the displays she'd curated Raymond's journals, behind glass, photographs documenting the discovery and revival, botanical illustrations showing the Vitis antiqua's distinctive characteristics. The education center had been her project, designed to tell the story properly while teaching visitors about viticulture, botany, and agricultural preservation. 5 minutes, she called to Carl. "You ready?" He wasn't, not really. Public speaking still made him nervous, still felt unnatural for a man who'd spent decades in pharmaceutical sales, avoiding the spotlight. But this mattered more than his comfort. Hugh found him before the ceremony started, carrying something wrapped in cloth. "Made this for you? Figured you'd need it." Carl unwrapped a wooden sign, beautifully carved with the words, "Menlo Vineyard Est, 1978. Below that, in smaller letters, "Rediscovered 2024. "Hugh, this is, don't get emotional on me. Just seemed right. Acknowledging that Raymond started all this. You can hang it at your farm entrance. Thank you. Really." Pastor Warren called everyone to order, and the opening ceremony began. The mayor spoke about economic development and regional tourism. Professor Pemberton discussed the scientific significance of the Vitis Antiqua revival. Josephine Crane, the master sommelier, had travelled from New York again to offer remarks about the wine's quality and historical importance. Then it was Carl's turn. He stood before 100 people, many of whom had become friends over the past 2 years, and tried to find words equal to the moment. Most of you know the story by now. A divorced pharmaceutical salesman inherits a junkyard, finds buried treasure, discovers his great-uncle was a botanical genius. It's a good story, but it's not the whole story. He paused, looking at faces in the crowd. Vernon, sitting beside his wife. Grady, leaning on his cane. Denise, tears already starting. Claudia, encouraging him with her eyes. The whole story is about a man who lost everything that mattered, his wife, his dreams, his hope, and decided that loss didn't have to be the end. Raymond could have given up, could have let grief consume him. Instead, he spent 40 years bringing something back from extinction, not because it would make him rich or famous, but because it was worth doing, because Margaret had wanted it, because beauty and growth matter even when no one's watching. I came here broken in my own way, not grieving a death, but grieving a life I'd wasted. And Raymond's work showed me that it's never too late to start growing something real. That patient work matters. That second chances are possible if you're willing to do the hard work of resurrection. He looked at Tupatenta, Claudia. I got my daughter back because of this place. Got to know a community that welcomed a stranger. Got to honor a man I barely knew but have come to admire more than almost anyone. That's what this cooperative really represents, not just wine, but the idea that we're better when we build together, when we honor what came before while creating something new. So yes, today we're opening a winery, but we're also opening a promise that Millbrook's best days don't have to be behind it, that working together we can grow something that sustains us all, that what was lost can be found and what's found can flourish. The applause was loud and long. Then Pastor Warren cut the ribbon and people flooded inside to tour the facility. Carl found himself swept up in conversations, handshakes, congratulations. He answered questions about the vines, the wine, the plans for future expansion. The first official vintage was ready, 500 bottles from the cooperative's initial harvest. Not the 3 original survivor vines this time, but grapes from a dozen local farms, all propagated from Raymond's successful grafts. The bottles were labeled Millbrook Revival, a community vintage, with an illustration of the original terrace vines. Wine experts who'd been given advance samples had already written reviews. The consensus was remarkable. This was a significant wine, commercially viable, with a story that would appeal to consumers who cared about agricultural heritage and sustainable local production. But the moment Carl treasured most came during the tasting reception. Each family in Millbrook had been given a bottle as thanks for their support. He watched people, farmers and shopkeepers, teachers and retirees, tasting wine made from grapes they'd helped grow, raised in facilities they'd helped build, celebrating work they'd all done together. Vernon approached, glass in hand. "This is good, really good. I've spent a lot of money on expensive wines, and this holds up." High praise from someone who usually acquires things rather than appreciates them. Vernon smiled, though it was still uncomfortable on his face. "I'm learning. Slowly. My wife says I'm almost bearable at dinner parties now." He grew serious. "I've been thinking about what you said, that people can change if given the chance. I want to believe that's true, that I'm not just the sum of my worst choices. You're proving it's true. Every day you choose different. It's harder than I expected. Being generous instead of acquisitive, building instead of taking, but also better, more satisfying." Vernon raised his glass. "To resurrection. Apparently it's not just for grapes." They drank together, former adversaries finding common ground in the taste of redeemed possibility. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Carl found himself on the mill's observation deck, looking out over Millbrook. The town that had seemed so faded and hopeless when he first arrived now showed signs of renewal, fresh paint on buildings, new businesses opening, young families moving in. The cooperative alone employed 15 people and would expand to 30 within 2 years. It wasn't just about the wine, it was about having something to hope for, something to build toward. The Vineyard Project had given Millbrook permission to believe its future could be different than its past. Claudia joined him on the deck, bringing 2 glasses of the Revival vintage. "To Raymond," she said, "to second chances." They drank, watching the sun set over a town that was learning to grow again. 3 years after Carl first drove down that muddy gravel road to inspect 40 acres he thought were worthless, he stood in the same spot on an April morning. But everything had changed. The vineyard now covered 15 acres of carefully tended rows. The farmhouse had been restored, its windows no longer rattling in the wind, its porch solid beneath his feet. The collapsed barn had been rebuilt as equipment storage and a workshop where Finn, home for spring break, was teaching younger volunteers proper grafting techniques. Carl was 60 years old now. His hands were permanently stained from work in the soil. His back ached most mornings, and he'd never been happier in his life. A car pulled up the gravel drive, Linda's car. She'd called last week asking if she could visit, see what all the news articles were about. Carl had said yes, curious and nervous in equal measure. She stepped out looking much as he remembered, though her hair was shorter and she carried herself with a lightness he didn't recall from their marriage. "Carl, this place is wow. It's been a lot of work. I can tell. It's beautiful." She walked slowly, taking in the neat rows of vines beginning to leaf out for the season. I saw the feature in the wine magazine and the story in the Times about rural agricultural revival. They called you a visionary. They're being generous. I just stumbled onto something Raymond built and tried not to ruin it. Linda smiled. That's not what Claudia says. She says you brought it to life, made it matter to people. She's here, actually, inside working on a research paper. Would you like to see her? In a minute. I came to see you first, to say something I should have said during the divorce. Linda turned to face him fully. I was angry for a long time. Angry about the years you were absent, the marriage that died from neglect. But watching what you've built here, reading about the cooperative and the community involvement, I realize you weren't broken. You were just planted in the wrong soil. Carl felt his throat tighten. Linda, let me finish. You needed dirt and purpose and work that mattered. I needed someone present for dinner and school events and the small daily moments that make a partnership work. Neither of us was wrong. We were just wrong for each other. She touched his arm gently. I'm glad you found this place. Glad you found yourself. You're doing something important here. Thank you for saying that. I'm also seeing someone. Getting serious, actually. He's a teacher. Very patient, very present. Everything you couldn't be. That's wonderful, really. Is it weird that we can say this to each other now? That we can be genuinely happy for each other's happiness? Not weird, just healthy. Finally, Carl gestured toward the farmhouse. Come on, Claudia will want to see you. The reunion between mother and daughter was warm, easier than Carl expected. Claudia gave Linda a tour, explaining the research, the propagation program, the cooperative's expansion plans. Linda listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she understood how significant this work was. I'm proud of you, Linda said to Claudia, and proud of your father too. You're both doing something that matters. After Linda left, Carl and Claudia worked together in the vineyard, pruning and checking for disease. It was work. They'd done hundreds of times now, their hands moving with practiced efficiency, their conversation easy. Mom seems happy, Claudia said. She does. I'm glad. Are you really? Yeah, I am. She deserves someone who can give her what I couldn't. Carl tied off a training wire. I spent so many years feeling guilty about the divorce, about failing the marriage, but I'm starting to understand that sometimes the kindest thing is letting someone go find what they actually need. That's very mature of you. I'm learning, slowly. They worked in comfortable silence until Pastor Warren's truck came up the drive. He and Denise visited weekly now, partly for friendship and partly because they'd invested in the cooperative and liked staying involved. Came to check on the vines, Pastor Warren said, and to tell you both something. The denomination is sending a journalist to write about how agricultural renewal can revitalize struggling communities. They want to use Millbrook as the case study. More publicity, Carl said. I don't know if I'm ready for that. You don't have to be ready. You just have to keep doing what you're doing, building something sustainable, bringing people together, showing that small towns can have futures. That evening, after everyone had left, Carl walked to Raymond's terrace, the hidden spot where he'd first discovered the survivor vines. The original 3 plants were gnarled and magnificent now, properly pruned and cared for, producing grapes that anchored the entire cooperative's production. He'd started coming here when he needed to think, to remember where everything began. It had become a kind of pilgrimage, a way of staying connected to the man whose work had saved his life without ever intending to. Claudia found him there as the sun set. I have news, she said. The university offered me tenure track, full position, not just assistant professor. It's official. Claudia, that's incredible. It means I'm staying. Long term. Building my career here, doing research on sustainable agricultural models and heritage crop preservation. She sat beside him on the stone wall. It means I'm home. Really home. Carl couldn't speak for a moment. That's the best news I've had in maybe ever. There's more. I've been seeing someone. Another professor. Ecology department. It's getting serious. I want you to meet him. I'd like that. They sat together as the light faded, watching the vineyard settle into evening. 3 years ago, Carl had been alone in a suburban house, contemplating a life that felt finished at 55. Now he had his daughter back, had purpose, had a community, had work that would continue long after he was gone. Do you think Raymond would be proud? Claudia asked. Of what we've done with his work? Carl thought about the journals, about the lonely man who'd spent 40 years grafting hope onto rootstock. I think he'd be amazed. Not just by the vineyard, but by the cooperative, the community involvement, all the people who've been touched by this. He worked alone because he thought he had to. We've shown that his legacy works better when it's shared. That's the point of resurrection, isn't it? Bringing something back, not to hoard it, but to let it grow beyond its original boundaries. When did you get so wise? I learned from watching you. Stumble your way toward wisdom yourself. They laughed together. The easy laughter of people who've traveled through hard things and come out closer on the other side. Carl thought about trajectory, how 3 years ago he'd been following a path toward quiet desperation and empty retirement. One letter, one inheritance, one decision to honor a stranger's work had changed everything. Not just for him, but for Claudia, for Millbrook, for the dozens of families whose livelihoods now depended on grapes that weren't supposed to exist. Tomorrow, they'd host another volunteer day. 50 people would show up to help with spring, planting, their labor given freely because they believed in what was growing here. The following week, a distribution deal would be finalized, putting Millbrook Revival wine in restaurants across 3 states. Next month, Finn would graduate with honors and return to work full-time on the vineyard expansion. The work would continue, would expand, would outlive Carl, just as it had outlived Raymond. That was the point of legacy, building something that could grow beyond your own years, planting seeds you might never see flourish, trusting that patient work compounds over time. Carl stood, offering his hand to help Claudia up. They walked back to the farmhouse together, where lights glowed warm against the deepening dusk. Inside, dinner was waiting, simple food, good company, the ordinary blessings of a life rebuilt from ruins. Before going in, Carl paused to look back at the vineyard one more time. 15 acres of carefully tended rows, each vine a small testament to persistence and faith. Behind them, invisible but present, Raymond's original 3 survivors stood on their hidden terrace, the foundation of everything that had grown. "Thank you," Carl whispered to the man he'd barely known but had come to love through his work, "for leaving this behind, for believing it mattered, for showing me what patient work can become." The wind rustled through new leaves, and Carl chose to hear it as benediction. He went inside to join his daughter for dinner, a man who'd inherited 40 acres of weeds and found in them everything worth living for. The vineyard would grow, the cooperative would prosper, Millbrook would thrive. And none of it would have been possible without a lonely man who'd spent 40 years resurrecting grapes from extinction, never knowing his work would save more than just a forgotten varietal. It would save a broken man who needed to learn how to grow again. And in that salvation, quiet, patient, rooted in soil and hope, Carl had found the second chance he hadn't known he was looking for. The land nobody wanted had become the thing that saved them all.